Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ukrainians literally in the crosshairs. The leaked telephone conversation revealing EU officials learned members of the opposition had hired snipers to kill innocent bystanders, and police is being largely ignored by the Western mainstream. This is very disturbing, though not surprising. The EU in Washington engineered this coup and continue to drive events. To crosstalk the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Brian Becker, in New York. He is the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition. In London, we have Alexander Nekrasov. He is a political commentator and former Kremlin advisor. And in Berlin, we cross to Manuel Oxenreiter. He is a journalist, editor, and reporter. Gentlemen, welcome to Crosstalk. Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Alexander, in London, if I go to you first here, as I started out in the introduction, this sniper story coming out of Kiev is being largely ignored by Western media. What explains that, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's part of the general picture of how the Western media and British media as well are covering the news, the events in Crimea. I know some of those hacks who actually stand there in front of the cameras in Crimea, and I'm astonished what they're saying. I mean, they're basically making up things as if they're facts. And they're filming sort of some irrelevant situations, and then they say, well, it's a huge story, it's a big story, it shows, it proves that it's an invasion, and so on and so on. So the word invasion and aggression are always used all the time. And of course, a lot of stories, wild stories, told about the Russian troops, surrounding armed troops. You remember that incident with those weird-looking Ukrainian people marching in a column with banners, singing. Imagine they went to work like that, approaching that base with 4 Russian soldiers standing there. This was presented as a sort of a brutal act of force by the Russian troops. I mean, this is ridiculous. So when you say why they're not showing that big story, Ashton talking to the Estonian foreign minister, well, I mean, it's just part of the overall picture.
Brian, I find it really disturbing is that the story about the snipers being hired by members of the coalition that are in power right now, that's not given much focus. But another story, the quote-unquote invasion of Crimea, again, there's hyperbole here. There are Russian troops that have been there since 1999 under an agreement between the government of Ukraine and Russia. But that doesn't seem to get much traction in the media. What I'm saying is facts don't get much traction.
Right, and not only has the leasing agreement allowed thousands of Russian troops to be in the Crimea, but of course the Crimea was part of Russia historically and only transferred as a largely administrative measure in the mid-1950s from Russia to the Ukraine when they were still one country, the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At that time, the transfer had no significance and certainly no geostrategic significance, and only assumed that after 1991, when the dissolution of the Soviet Union meant that the Ukraine became a big prize, as did all the other former Soviet non-Russian republics, for targeting by U.S. and NATO powers and absorption into a Western sphere of influence. When you see the fact that the Western media is not giving any coverage at all to the discussions about the possible use of snipers by the fascist and semi-fascist forces as a provocation, that too is just part of the big propaganda campaign. Of course, we remember that the fascists used the Reichstag fire in 1933 as a provocation to carry out a putsch then in Germany and to destroy the progressive and communist and socialist forces that were dominant in Germany. And we know the U.S. government uses pretexts all the time, from the Gulf of Tonkin that started the Vietnam War and ever since. So we see that these tactics, including use of provocations and creating a narrative that shows that the Yakovlevich government, which was overthrown in a coup d'etat, was in fact the perpetrator, when what we appear to see now is, since the end of November, a deliberately staged EU/US coup d'etat using semi-fascist and fascist forces to overthrow an elected government. Perhaps a corrupt government, but an elected government.
It's interesting, Manuel, if I go to you in Berlin, I mean, you can connect the dots here. You have the Newland tape. We have this tape now about the snipers. I mean, it's very interesting is that no one in Western media wants to make these kind of connections here. They want to look at a supposed invasion from Russia, which is a complete myth. But at the same time, you know, it's Russia strangling, holding hostage Ukraine. It's a complete fiction. But it seems to be working. There are going to be sanctions, right?
Yes, first of all, we should really stop to be angry and to be upset about lies of Western mainstream media, because it will not change. All this conflict in Ukraine is about geopolitics. It's a pure geopolitical conflict. No ideology, no party, no criminal, no oligarch or anything else plays a role. It's about geopolitical interests. The mainstream media, the Western mainstream media, plays a certain role in this war, in this geopolitical conflict. It plays the role of the pre-war artillery on the people, on its own people in Europe and on the West. And we shouldn't be surprised at all when the stories seem to us orchestrated, they are silenced, or they are put into a much different context than they should. We shouldn't be surprised that until today this phone tape, this really important phone tape about the snipers, and we are talking there about a huge crime, by the way, not about little corruption or so. We are talking about killing people right now, but it is presented as a sort of conspiracy theory. So we shouldn't wonder. And on the other side, what you were mentioning, Peter, is completely correct, that we are talking about a Russian aggression, a Russian invasion, and so on, although nothing takes place. On the other side, when the West does an invasion and an aggression, we are not using those terms in Western mainstream media. They talk about humanitarian intervention. When we do air raids, when Western air forces do air raids, it is a non-flight zone they are turning out. So we shouldn't wonder at all about the things, how they are presented by Western mainstream media, and our chance is simply to do it much better, and I think we are doing it right now here.
Alexander, what I find truly astounding is these neo-Nazis in Kiev right now that the EU and Washington is embracing. People have asked me all through this crisis, what do the Russians, what are they afraid of in the East? Well, they're afraid of a lot of these people, the rhetoric and some of the laws that they want to pass here. It's truly terrifying, and it does remind us all of the 1930s in Europe. There's real justification for fear on the part of Russian minorities in Ukraine.
Well, you know, Peter, I need to say something about this whole situation. You know, this anything goes morality, liberal morality, which has strengthened itself in the West, has now spread to economics, to politics, to culture, to everywhere. And this sort of attitude, if you can get away with it, do it. I think that's how I will describe what the West is doing in Ukraine. There's absolutely no limits to what they, you know, how far they can go in basically calling black white and white black. And I'm frankly a bit confused by the so-called de-escalation that they were talking all the time. And I mentioned to them here, to the British hacks, I said, guys, how about you de-escalating a bit? How about you not calling on Russia to de-escalate, but you de-escalate and stop inflating and inflaming the situation and provoking violence? Because some of the comments which I see from Crimea, I tell you, this is inflammatory, bordering on provoking violence. And which I find amazing.
Alexander, this is what I think. I agree with you. This is what, Brian, if I go to New York, these folks in Kiev want violence. They don't want an election because they know if it was free and fair, they would never make it into power legally. They want violence. It's the only way they're going to be able to stay in power, and the EU and Washington is backing them up.
I mean, let's not forget the ousted government, the government that was overthrown by a coup d'etat. That government actually was not opposed to integration with the EU. What they did is they refused to sign on to the agreement at the end of November, which imposed harsh austerity, severe harsh austerity on the Ukrainian working population. And they were offered a better deal from Russia, not because Russia was demanding as an ultimatum, make your decision, Europe or Russia, not at all. They offered them an economic agreement that did not impose austerity, and the elected government chose to go with that agreement. At that moment, starting that night, these protests began, and they were sustained day after day after day because of the interference by EU, NATO, and U.S. officials that said, keep going for it, guys. Keep sustaining your protests. And even when it turned into an armed struggle, they still brought pastries to the square in Maidan to show that the West was with them with all of their vast economic and military power. The EU and the United States and NATO have the blood of those who died in downtown Kiev on their hands because they deliberately provoked it for geostrategic purposes to limit, to encircle Russia, and of course to put into place in Kiev, even if it's fascist-led, a government that will owe its existence to Western forces.
You know, Manuel, if I go back to you in Berlin, it's very interesting, the February 21st agreement, this is what's killed what was left of democracy in Ukraine. And Mr. Kerry goes around and talks about democracy. It's, again, hypocrisy.
It's absolute hypocrisy, because what was mentioned already is very right. The only way now for the West to gain and to keep the control about vast regions of Ukraine, of course on Kiev, is the strategy of tension. I think any election, a whole national election in Ukraine where the East and the South would elect, the people would see very quick that the country is still split, that there is not an 80% majority for the so-called revolution or so. I think it's not in the interest of the West, particularly not in the interest of John Kerry, who is, in my opinion, maybe the best paid liar in the Western world. I think the most professional, best paid liar. We have just to remember what he did with Syria, what he did with other with other foreign politics topics. I think it's very often that when he opens his mouth, you shouldn't believe what he says.
All right. On that note, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT.
I love you.